My name is Hector, and sharing this chapter of my life isn't easy. I often wonder why so many men, including myself, feel compelled to find completion in relationships and the conventional idea of family. If that belief hadn't been so deeply ingrained in me, perhaps I wouldn't have entered another relationship after the turmoil my ex-wife, Allison, brought into my world. To keep my anonymity, we'll stick with Hector as my name. At the time of this story, I was 33, and Allison was 27. Our meeting wasn't a classic romance. We weren't high school sweethearts or college lovers. We met in the most unexpected way, through my job as a customer care representative. She was just another frustrated caller at first, reaching out to complain about one of our products. Fate, or whatever you'd like to call it, assigned me to handle her issue. That seemingly ordinary call turned into an unplanned, casual conversation that somehow sparked an unexpected connection. What began as a typical customer interaction evolved into friendship, and from there, it grew into something deeper. At the time, I took it as a sign. I had been praying for guidance in finding a life partner, and Allison seemed to arrive as if she were an answer to that prayer. Allison worked as a marketer for a real estate company and appeared to be successful and driven. Unlike many men, I didn't mind that she earned more than I did. I was content with my life, living on a modest salary and working hard to keep things going. During the year we dated, I never suspected she would betray me. I had experienced infidelity in high school, but this was different. My connection with Allison felt real and built on trust. For the first time, I felt like I had found genuine love. She made me feel like the luckiest man alive. When I introduced Allison to my parents, they loved her instantly. Her calm, affectionate nature won them over quickly. On her side, her parents welcomed me warmly as well. It all seemed perfect, like puzzle pieces, falling into place. Feeling confident, I proposed, and to my relief and joy, she said yes. Our wedding was a beautiful celebration shared with friends, family, and colleagues. Among the guests was Scott, a coworker Allison had mentioned before. I hadn't thought much about him. Meeting him for the first time at our wedding seemed innocuous. The first months of our marriage felt blissful, filled with the excitement of starting a new chapter together. We moved into a larger apartment that met Allison's high standards, moving away from my modest bachelor pad. I was happy to take that step, even though it came with higher expenses. Allison proved to be an attentive and caring wife, handling many of the household chores and making our home feel warm and welcoming. She often took on the heavier responsibilities, and I appreciated her effort. Life felt good, stable. However, things began to shift as Allison's career took off. Within 9 months of our marriage, she had been promoted twice and was making significantly more money. While I was genuinely proud of her success, it came at a cost. Her job demanded constant travel, meetings with clients, attending high-stakes property showings, and long work dinners became the norm. It felt like she was always on the move, and we rarely spent a full week together. The plans we made were often interrupted, rescheduled, or canceled altogether. Conversations about her frequent absences turned into delicate, almost rehearsed exchanges. I tried to express how I felt left behind, neglected by the whirlwind of her career. She listened, but her responses were always the same. She had to meet her career demands, and making money was necessary. The emotional distance between us grew. What hurt more was how intertwined her schedule seemed to be with Scott's. He became a near-permanent fixture in her stories, always by her side during those urgent meetings and business trips. At first, I tried to suppress the insecurity gnawing at me. The logical side of my brain kept reminding me that Allison had always been faithful, that I shouldn't let jealousy get the better of me. But the evidence was hard to ignore. Scott was either picking her up from our house early in the morning or calling her at the crack of dawn to remind her of a flight or meeting. Even breakfast, one of the few moments we had together, was often cut short by her rushing out the door to meet him. The more I tried to discuss this, the more strained our conversations became. Allison always had a reason, always an explanation for why things had to be the way they were. She never seemed to notice how much the situation was impacting me. On the rare nights she was home, it felt as if her mind was still elsewhere, constantly buzzing with the next task or appointment. One evening, I decided to wait up for her. She had told me she'd be home by 9 p.m., but it was nearly midnight when she walked in. Her makeup was smudged, her hair slightly disheveled. She apologized, mentioning that Scott had convinced her to stay late to go over client details. It was always Scott. My stomach twisted as I nodded, pretending to believe her, but the seed of doubt had already grown roots. The breaking point came unexpectedly. One evening, as I sat alone, the knock at the door startled me. I opened it to find a group of policemen holding a warrant. They asked me to come with them for questioning, leaving me confused and alarmed. Allison had left for another supposed business trip earlier that day, so I couldn't fathom why I was being taken to the station. The police station was cold and unwelcoming. I sat in an interrogation room, alone and bewildered, waiting for an explanation. After what felt like an eternity, a female officer entered. She started questioning me about Allison and Scott, pressing for details that seemed completely disconnected from my reality. I explained what I knew, that Scott was her co-worker and that they often traveled for work. I recounted the night before, how Scott had called Allison to inform her of an urgent client meeting in a neighboring state. But my answers didn't seem to satisfy them. More officers joined, bombarding me with questions and insinuations, but they refused to explain why I was there. They took my phone, claiming they needed to keep it for further examination. Panic set in as I sat in that room, hour after hour, growing increasingly anxious and exhausted. Why was Scott so important to them? Did something happen on their trip? The scenarios running through my mind became darker as the hours passed. Finally, their tone shifted. They began suggesting that I was jealous and implying that I might have been driven to act irrationally because of it. The accusations, thinly veiled in their questions, pushed me to my breaking point. I demanded to know why I was there, why they were fixated on Scott, and what he had to do with me. The room fell silent, and the officers exchanged looks. It was then that they revealed the truth. Scott had never left town with Allison. The supposed trip had been a lie. Scott had been attacked and hospitalized, and Allison was with him when it happened. The shock left me breathless. The woman I trusted had deceived me, and the implications of the officers' questions began to make sense. Scott and Allison were more than just co-workers, they were involved. My suspicions, long brushed aside, were true. The betrayal hit like a physical blow, leaving me numb and struggling to process it all. The officers continued their line of questioning, prying for any sign that I might have been involved out of jealousy. I felt like I was trapped in a nightmare, accused of crimes driven by emotions I hadn't acted on. Exhaustion overtook me as I explained repeatedly that I knew nothing of Scott's personal life outside work. Their probing suggested there was more to Scott's relationships, multiple women, a tangled web that I was unknowingly caught in by association. After hours of relentless questioning, they released me. The officers realized that my shock and confusion were genuine, that I was as much a victim as anyone in this sordid tale. I drove home in silence, the weight of the truth pressing down on me. Scott hadn't just been her colleague, he had been her lover. The life I thought I shared with Allison was a lie. When I got my phone back, there were no messages or missed calls from Allison. Determined to confront her, I called, my hands trembling as I dialed. She picked up after a couple of rings, her voice weary as she said she was at the hospital with Scott. The confirmation of her infidelity pushed me over the edge. There was no more doubt, no more benefit of the doubt to give. That night, I stayed up packing her belongings, each item a painful reminder of what we once had. The next morning, I called my workplace, citing a family emergency, and drove her things to her parents' house. I left without speaking to them or her, determined to sever ties completely. When Allison returned days later, she looked broken and informed me that Scott had succumbed to severe burns from the incident. The news did nothing to move me. I told her everything I knew, that I was aware of their affair. She broke down, pleading and insisting it was a one-time mistake, but it was too late. I had already reached out to a lawyer and initiated divorce proceedings. I couldn't bear to stay with someone who had deceived me so completely. The trust was gone, shattered beyond repair. The days that followed were a strange mix of relief and grief. I had taken the first steps toward cutting Allison out of my life, but the emotional wreckage she left behind was overwhelming. Her calls and messages became a constant presence, filled with tearful apologies and empty promises. She begged for a chance to explain, swearing that it had been a mistake, but I couldn't bring myself to listen. The betrayal was too profound, the lies too numerous. I had already made my choice, and there was no turning back. Allison's parents reached out, confused and heartbroken. They hadn't known the full extent of what had happened until I showed up with her things. They tried to mediate, suggesting counseling or at least a conversation, but I stood firm. The marriage I thought I had was gone, and nothing could rebuild it. I wanted peace, even if that peace was lonely and hollow for the time being. The divorce process was emotionally taxing, but it was also a necessary step toward reclaiming my life. I leaned on friends and family who reminded me that the pain would eventually fade. Work became a distraction, an anchor that kept me grounded when the memories threatened to drown me. Nights were the hardest. I'd lie awake, haunted by images of Allison and Scott, replaying the months of lies in my mind, questioning how I hadn't seen it coming. The weight of betrayal had me doubting my ability to trust again, to let anyone close. Months passed, and the divorce was finalized. Allison continued to reach out sporadically, but I never responded. I refused to allow her back into my life, not after the humiliation, the deceit, and the involvement of police and suspicions. There were moments when anger would flare up, a mix of frustration at her audacity and my own gullibility. But slowly, the anger began to dull, replaced by a determined sense of self-preservation. Healing was a slow process. I avoided relationships, unsure if I could ever open myself up to that level of vulnerability again. Trust felt like a distant concept, something fragile and out of reach. The scars of betrayal were deep, but over time, they began to blend into the fabric of who I was becoming, a man who had endured and survived. Allison tried to come back months after our divorce, reaching out to see if we could start anew. But I couldn't entertain the thought. The past was an anchor I wasn't willing to carry anymore. I had rebuilt too much to let her tear it down again. To this day, the experience has shaped how I view love and trust. It's made me wary, more guarded, but also stronger. I've learned that while betrayal can break you, it doesn't have to define you. Moving forward, I hold on to that hard-earned lesson and focus on what I can build for myself and my future. Dear listener, if you've reached this far, thank you for sharing in my story. Your support means everything. If you found any part of this story helpful or meaningful, please consider subscribing. It's a small gesture that makes a big difference.